Picture this, you're at a drive-in, one of those classic ones,
Mm-hmm.
with the crackling speakers and that smell of popcorn, just kind of hanging in the air. It's like a perfect escape, a little slice of Americana right in the heart of Atlanta.
Yeah, it is a strong image. That sense of normalcy and nostalgia, I think it really uh, makes the contrast with what's to come even more stark.
Exactly, because this isn't just any drive-in, and this isn't just any story. This is the Starlight Drive-In, and that's where we first meet Vienna Forrest and their partner Tortuga. They're on a date, catching a movie just like anyone else. But in just a few short hours, their lives are going to be completely changed.
What we're diving into today is the We Came to the Forest podcast. It's an investigative series that unravels this tragic confrontation in the very city where that drive-in sits. It's a story about activism, environmentalism, and that sometimes really brutal clash between those who want to protect the natural world and those who are tasked with upholding order.
And what makes this story even more gripping is that it's rooted in a very real and very immediate issue. The proposed construction of a massive police training facility right in the middle of a beloved Atlanta forest.
This facility was quickly dubbed Cop City by its opponents, and it became a flashpoint for tensions that had been simmering for years. On one side, you have city officials and law enforcement arguing that this facility is essential for public safety, a necessary tool for training officers in an increasingly complex world.
And on the other side, you have activists like Vienna and Tortuga,
Hmm.
who see this facility as a dangerous step towards the militarization of the police force. They believe it represents a threat to the environment, to civil liberties, and to the very soul of their community.
And it's important to remember that the activists' concerns weren't just about the physical footprint of this facility. They were also deeply troubled by some of its planned features.
Like what?
Well, for instance, Cop City was set to include a mock city for urban warfare training, a firing range, and even a driving course. These features, to many, symbolize an escalation of force, a shift towards a more aggressive and confrontational style of policing.
And it's this clash of ideologies that ultimately sets the stage for the events that unfold in the podcast. We see activists putting their bodies on the line, determined to protect the forest they see as sacred. And we see law enforcement armed and ready to clear the area, operating under the belief that they're dealing with a dangerous and potentially violent group.
And that's where the story takes a dark turn. We Came to the Forest doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of this conflict. It plunges us into the chaos and confusion of a nighttime police raid, a raid that ends with gunfire injuries and the tragic death of Tortuga.
And that's where the real mystery begins, because as the podcast unfolds, we're forced to grapple with a series of unsettling questions. Were the activists truly a threat? Were the police justified in using such forceful tactics? And perhaps most importantly, what really happened that night in the forest?
What's fascinating about this podcast is that it doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it meticulously pieces together the events leading up to the raid, drawing on firsthand accounts from both sides of the conflict. We hear from Vienna, who paints a vivid picture of the activist community and their unwavering dedication to protecting the forest.
And we also hear from law enforcement officials who describe their perspective, the intelligence they were given, and the perceived dangers they believed they were facing.
This multifaceted approach is what makes We Came to the Forest so compelling. It's not just a story about a protest gone wrong, it's a deep dive into the complexities of modern activism, the challenges of maintaining order in a deeply divided society, and the human cost of these clashes.
Right. And as we continue to explore this podcast together, we'll be unpacking these themes in more detail. We'll be looking at the motivations of both sides, the role of the media in shaping public perception, and the broader implications of this case for the future of environmental activism and law enforcement.
But before we delve further into those specific aspects, let's rewind a bit and take a closer look at the individuals at the heart of this story, specifically Vienna and Tortuga. Who were they, and what led them to become so deeply involved in the fight to save the forest?
That's a great place to start, because to really understand this story, you need to understand the people who lived it, the people who believed so passionately in their cause that they were willing to risk everything.
The We Came to the Forest podcast really paints this intimate portrait of Vienna and Tortuga, especially in those early days of their involvement in the movement.
Yeah, it is interesting because they didn't come from a background of like hardcore activism. They weren't like seasoned protesters or anything like that.
Right, and that's what makes their story so relatable, I think. They were just ordinary people who were drawn into this movement because they felt this deep connection to the forest and a growing sense of unease about the direction their city was heading in.
So what was it about the forest that resonated so strongly with them?
Well, the podcast actually features recordings of Vienna talking about how they saw the forest as this refuge, this place of peace and tranquility in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. Tortuga, on the other hand, was fascinated by the biodiversity of the forest, all the different species of plants and animals that called it home.
And this wasn't just some abstract concept for them, was it? They really lived it, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They spent months living in the forest, building shelters, planting gardens, even organizing community events to raise awareness about the importance of protecting this natural space.
It's amazing how they managed to create a whole community there.
It really is. And the podcast does a great job of capturing that sense of community. The shared meals, the late-night conversations, the feeling that they were all in this together fighting for something bigger than themselves.
But it wasn't all idyllic, was it? There were already signs of trouble brewing even before the raid, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The podcast details several instances where law enforcement came into the forest to remove activists, often using forceful tactics. There were arrests, reports of police brutality, and this growing sense of fear and suspicion on both sides.
I can imagine how those early encounters must have shaped the activist perception of the police.
Definitely. And I think it's important to understand that context because it helps to explain why the activists were so distrustful of the authorities and why they felt the need to defend themselves and their encampment.
So even before the Cop City proposal came along, there was already this underlying tension, this sense that the activists and the police were on a collision course.
Precisely. And the proposed construction of the training facility just poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
It's like all the anxieties, all the fears that the activists had about the increasing militarization of the police force suddenly crystallized around this one project.
Exactly. And the name itself, Cop City, became a rallying cry for the opposition, a symbol of everything they were fighting against.
And remember, this wasn't just about abstract principles. This was about a real place, a place that held deep personal meaning for the activists.
Right. They had invested so much time and energy into building a community in that forest, into trying to live in harmony with nature. The idea of a massive police training facility being built there with all the noise, the pollution, the potential for violence, it felt like a profound violation.
It's like the city was saying, your way of life doesn't matter. Progress, or at least our version of it, takes precedence.
And that's what made this conflict so intractable. It wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about two fundamentally different visions of what the city should be, what it should value.
And tragically, it seems like neither side was willing to back down to truly listen to the other's perspective.
That's the heartbreaking part of this story. The We Came to the Forest podcast makes it clear that there were missed opportunities for dialogue, for de-escalation. And ultimately, those missed opportunities led to that fateful night in the forest, the night that changed everything.
So let's talk about that night. Let's talk about the raid itself. What does the podcast reveal about the events leading up to that moment?
Well, the podcast paints a picture of escalating tensions in the days leading up to the raid. There were reports of increased police presence around the forest, rumors of a planned operation to clear the area.
So the activists knew something was coming.
It seems that way. And according to Vienna's account in the podcast, they were determined to stand their ground to defend their encampment.
But were they truly prepared for what was about to happen? Did they understand the level of force that the police were prepared to use? Yeah, that is the question that kind of hangs over this entire story, right? Was anyone truly prepared for the violence that happened that night?
It's tough to say for sure, but what the We Came to the Forest podcast does so effectively is it takes us right inside that raid, moment by agonizing moment. We hear the sounds of shouting, the crackle of gunfire, the just sheer terror in the voices of those who were there.
And it's through those firsthand accounts that we begin to piece together a picture of what happened, albeit a very fragmented and often contradictory one.
Right, and that's where the real investigative work of the podcast comes in. Because as we delve deeper into those official narratives and we compare them to the eyewitness testimonies, we start to notice these discrepancies, gaps in the story, things that just don't add up.
For example, the initial police reports claimed that the activists fired the first shots, that they were essentially ambushing the officers.
Oh.
But the podcast actually presents evidence that challenges that version of events.
Exactly. There are witness statements, for example, that suggest that the police arrived on the scene already firing, that the activists were caught completely off guard, and then you have the issue of the alleged booby traps that the police claimed were set up in the forest.
Right. Those booby traps were a big part of the justification for the raid in the first place. The police argued that they had credible intelligence indicating that the activists were armed and dangerous, that they had set up these elaborate traps to injure or even kill officers.
But the podcast raises some serious questions about the veracity of those claims. They point out that no actual booby traps were ever found, that there's no physical evidence to support the police's assertions. And they suggest that these warnings of booby traps may have been exaggerated or even fabricated to create a pretext for a more aggressive operation.
Which is a chilling thought, if true. Because if the police were operating under false pretenses, if they went into that raid believing they were facing a level of threat that simply didn't exist, then that raises some very serious questions about their use of force, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that brings us to perhaps the most troubling aspect of this whole story, the shooting of Tortuga.
The podcast, while not being able to definitively say what happened in those final moments, lays out the known facts in a very stark and unsettling way. Tortuga was unarmed. They were shot multiple times by police officers. And to this day, there is no clear consensus on what led to those fatal shots being fired.
And that ambiguity, that lack of clear answers, has fueled so much outrage and distrust within the community. Many people, particularly those who were close to Tortuga and the activist movement, believe that there was a cover-up, that the truth about what happened is being deliberately suppressed.
And it's not just the activists who are demanding answers. The We Came to the Forest podcast has sparked a much wider conversation about police accountability, about the use of force, about the need for independent investigations when these kinds of tragedies occur.
And it's forced city officials to confront some really uncomfortable questions about their own role in this whole tragedy. Were there warning signs that were ignored? Was there a rush to judgment, a willingness to believe the worst about the activists?
It's important to remember that there were some city officials who did express sympathy for Tortuga and called for a thorough investigation. But there were also those who defended the police's actions, arguing that they were simply doing their job, responding to a perceived threat in a volatile situation.
And that's the challenge we face as a society, isn't it? How do we balance the need for law and order with the right to dissent, the right to protest, the right to protect the things we hold dear?
It's a very complex issue with no easy answers. But I think that We Came to the Forest podcast, by shedding light on this specific case, by giving voice to those who are often marginalized and silenced, has forced us to confront those questions in a much more meaningful way.
And ultimately, that's the power of investigative journalism. It's not just about uncovering the truth. It's about sparking a conversation, about challenging our assumptions, about demanding better from those in power.
And I think for anyone who's been touched by this story, whether you're an activist, concerned citizen, or simply someone who believes in justice, it's clear that the fight for answers, the fight for accountability, is far from over.
And that's something that all of us, regardless of where we stand on the issues at play, need to keep in mind as the story continues to unfold.
And if you, like us, are looking for those answers, are yearning to delve deeper into this complex and tragic story, then I highly recommend you listen to the full We Came to the Forest podcast. It's a powerful and thought-provoking experience that will stay with you long after you've finished listening.
And it's a reminder that the stories we tell, the stories we choose to listen to, have the power to shape our understanding of the world and to inspire us to make it a more just and equitable place.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration of the stories shaping our world.